Arthur Morgan stood at his fence line in the gray dawn light, rifle steady in his weathered hands, staring at the woman wrapped in nothing but a torn blanket who sobbed at his gate. 10 years of carefully constructed solitude stretched behind him. 10 years of silence that kept the war screams quiet in his head. The woman looked up through tangled hair. Her eyes held the kind of desperation that Arthur recognized in his own reflection. "Please," she whispered. "They're coming for me." Dust clouds gathered on the horizon. Riders with torches cutting through the morning mist. Arthur's hands began their familiar tremor. The rifle barrel wavered despite his grip. Battle memories clawed at the edges of his vision. He should turn away, walk back to his cabin. Let the world handle its own troubles. Instead, Arthur opened the gate. The woman stumbled through, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the dirt. Arthur guided her toward the barn, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. His chest tightened with each hoofbeat. The careful walls he had built around his mind began to crack. "Hide in the loft," he said. "Don't make a sound." She nodded and disappeared into the shadows above. Arthur positioned himself in the doorway, rifle across his arms. The riders came hard and fast, their horses throwing up clouds of dust that caught the early light. Sheriff Hosea Matthews pulled up first, his badge glinting against his leather vest. 3 men flanked him, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of men on a hunt. "Morning, Arthur." Matthews tipped his hat. "We're tracking a runaway, criminal type, dangerous." Arthur felt sweat gather at his collar. His breathing grew shallow. The sheriff's voice echoed strangely, mixing with remembered sounds of cannon fire and dying men. "Haven't seen anyone, Sheriff." Matthews studied Arthur's face. "You sure about that?" "We followed tracks right to your property." The rifle grew heavy in Arthur's hands. His vision blurred at the edges. 10 years of peace crumbling with each passing second, I'm sure. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. "Maybe we should search the place. Make certain." Arthur's finger found the trigger. The movement was automatic, trained into his bones during years of war. Matthews noticed. "Now, Arthur, no need for hostility. We're just doing our job." The words came from far away. Arthur fought to keep his breathing steady. In the loft above, he heard the softest creak of wood. The woman was listening. "Property's mine," Arthur said. "You need a warrant to search it." Matthews smiled without warmth. "Funny thing about warrants. Sometimes they take a while to come through. Sometimes a dangerous criminal gets away while we're waiting on paperwork." The threat hung in the air between them. Arthur's world had been simple before sunrise. Now it balanced on the edge of a knife. "I told you I haven't seen anyone." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Then he wheeled his horse around, signaling to his men. "We'll be back, Arthur. Count on it." They rode away, leaving Arthur alone with the echo of hoofbeats and the weight of his choice. His hands shook violently now. The rifle clattered to the ground. He staggered to the water trough and splashed his face. The cold helped clear the fog from his mind. Above him, the woman climbed down from the loft, moving carefully on her injured feet. "Thank you," she said. Arthur couldn't look at her directly. His carefully constructed isolation had protected him from moments like this. From human connection that demanded he be more than just a man hiding from his past. "They'll be back," he said. "You can't stay here. I know." She moved toward the barn door, favoring her left foot. Arthur noticed the cuts on her arms, the bruises on her shoulders. Whatever she was running from had left its mark. "Where will you go?" She paused at the doorway. "I don't know." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Arthur watched the woman stare at the empty horizon. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion and something deeper. Hopelessness, maybe. Or the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from running too long with nowhere to run to. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin," Arthur heard himself say. "You can rest there." Until you figure out your next move. She turned back to him, surprise flickering across her face. You don't even know my name. Don't need to. They walked to the cellar in silence. Arthur lifted the heavy wooden door, revealing a cool, dark space lined with shelves of preserved food. A place where a person could hide from the world above. I'm Machan, she said as she descended the wooden steps. Arthur nodded. Arthur Morgan. He closed the door and stood alone in his yard. The morning felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. His decade of solitude was over, and he had no idea what would replace it. Inside the cabin, Arthur cleaned his rifle and tried to ignore the way his hands continued to shake. The war had taught him that every choice carried consequences. Some took years to unfold. This one felt immediate and final. He moved to the window and scanned the horizon. The sheriff would return, and next time he might bring more men, or a warrant, or worse. Arthur had spent 10 years learning to live with his demons. Now he would discover if that hard-won peace was worth the cost of turning his back on someone who needed help. The sun climbed. Toward noon. Somewhere beneath his feet, a stranger named Machan waited in the dark, trusting a man she had never met to keep her safe from whatever horrors had driven her to his fence. Arthur Morgan had lived alone for years. That solitude had just become the most dangerous thing he had ever shared. Arthur brought water and hardtack to the cellar at midday. Machan sat in the corner, her makeshift blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She had fashioned bandages from strips of cloth, wrapping her feet with the precision of someone who understood wounds. You know medicine, Arthur said. Machan looked up from her work. I know survival. Her voice carried an education that didn't match her story. Arthur set the food down and studied her hands. No calluses from kitchen work. No permanent stains from laundry soap. These were hands that had held books more often than they had held scrub brushes. You said you were a mail-order bride. I am. For who? Samuel Tucker. The name came out flat and hard. He placed advertisements in newspapers back east, promised a good life in Wyoming territory. Arthur knew the name. Tucker owned land north of town, ran cattle and horses. He had money and influence with the sheriff's office. The kind of man who got what he wanted without asking twice. What happened? Mitchen's fingers stilled on the bandage. I arrived 3 days ago. Discovered the arrangement wasn't what I expected. She offered no details. Arthur recognized the weight of unspoken trauma. He carried enough of his own to know when someone was holding back pieces of their story. Tucker's got connections, Arthur said. Sheriff Matthews does favors for him. I noticed. Arthur climbed back up the cellar steps, leaving Machan to her silence. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. He worked his small vegetable garden, pulling weeds and checking the growth of his tomatoes. The familiar rhythm of simple tasks helped calm the tremor in his hands. Near sunset, he heard horses approaching. Arthur grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Sheriff Matthews rode alone this time, his horse picking its way carefully up the dirt path to the cabin. Arthur stepped onto his porch, weapon visible but not raised. Matthews dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. Evening, Arthur. Sheriff. Been thinking about our conversation this morning. About that dangerous criminal we're hunting. Arthur waited. The sheriff walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. The sun hung low behind him, casting his face in shadow. Samuel Tucker's offering a reward, Matthews said. $500 for information leading to the return of his property. The word hung heavy in the air. Property, not person, not woman. Arthur's grip tightened on the rifle. Don't know anything about Tucker's property. Matthews smiled. Course you don't. Just thought you should know the stakes. $500 is a lot of money for a man living alone on hardscrabble land. The sheriff untied his horse and mounted up, Think about it, Arthur. Sometimes, doing the right thing means making hard choices. Arthur watched him ride away until the dust settled and the evening quiet returned. He stood on his porch until full darkness fell, listening to the sounds of the night and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Inside the cabin, he lit a single candle and sat at his wooden table. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. Arthur opened a small wooden box and removed a folded piece of paper. His military discharge papers. The documents that gave him the name Arthur Morgan and erased the man he had been before. He studied the official seal and the careful handwriting. 10 years of protection contained in a single sheet of paper. 10 years of peace built on a foundation of lies. Arthur folded the papers and returned them to the box. He blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, thinking about $500 and the weight of choices yet to be made. The next morning, Arthur brought coffee to the cellar. Michan had recovered some of her strength. She sat straighter, her eyes more alert. The color had returned to her cheeks. "You're feeling better." "Some." Arthur handed her the cup. "There." Fingers brushed as she took it, and he noticed the steadiness of her grip. No tremor, no weakness. Whatever had driven her to his fence, it hadn't broken her. "Tell me about Samuel Tucker," she said. Arthur described what he knew. Tucker's ranch. His business dealings. His reputation for getting his way through money and intimidation. Michan listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing. "He's not working alone," she said finally. "What do you mean?" "The operation is bigger than one ranch. There are other women, other arrangements." Arthur set down his coffee cup. "How do you know?" "I saw them." She offered no more details. Arthur climbed out of the cellar and walked to his fence line. The morning air carried the scent of rain, though no clouds marked the horizon. He studied the empty landscape and tried to understand what he had stumbled into. A mail-order bride who spoke with education and handled wounds with professional skill. A sheriff who called her property instead of person. A wealthy rancher offering reward money for her return. None of it added up to a simple story of domestic trouble. Arthur spent the day working his land, but his mind remained on the woman hidden beneath his cabin. Her story had holes large enough to drive a wagon through. Every answer she gave raised new questions. That evening, he brought her soup and bread. She ate carefully, taking small bites and chewing slowly. Her manner spoke of formal training. Table etiquette learned in dining rooms with fine china and proper silverware. "Where are you from?" Arthur asked. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." Michan set down her spoon. "Boston. I answered Tucker's advertisement in the newspaper there." "What did you do in Boston?" "Worked." Arthur waited for more information. None came. He studied her face in the candlelight, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances. "The sheriff came back yesterday," he said. "Tucker's offering $500 for your return." Something flickered across Mitchen's face. Not fear, something closer to satisfaction. "That's a lot of money for a simple bride." "It is." Arthur climbed back to ground level and secured the cellar door. He walked to his cabin and retrieved the wooden box from his table. Inside, beneath his military papers, lay a smaller folded document. A wanted poster from 10 years ago. The face in the crude drawing bore little resemblance to the man he had become, but the name was clear enough. John Marston. Confederate deserter. Reward for capture. Arthur had built his new life on the assumption that his past was buried deep enough to stay hidden. Now he wondered if secrets had a way of finding each other in the darkness. He returned the poster to the box and locked it away. Tomorrow would bring new choices. New tests of the peace he had worked so hard to build. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the dust and rattling the windows. Arthur lay on his narrow bed and listened to the sound of his own breathing. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, a woman with secrets of her own waited in the dark. Two strangers bound together by circumstance and the weight of truths they were not ready to share. Arthur rode out at dawn to check his fence line, leaving Machan alone in the cellar. The morning air carried the promise of another scorching day. His horse picked its way carefully through the rocky ground, hooves finding purchase on stone worn smooth by years of wind and weather. The infected wound on his shoulder throbbed with each movement, an old war injury that never healed properly, always threatening to break open when he pushed too hard. Arthur had learned to live with pain that came in waves, rising and falling. With the changing seasons, he dismounted near the eastern boundary of his property and examined the fence posts. The wood showed signs of rot at the base, another task to add to his growing list of repairs. A man alone always fought a losing battle against the slow decay of neglect. Arthur worked methodically, replacing rotted boards and tightening loose wire. The repetitive motion helped quiet the restless energy that had plagued him since Machan's arrival. Physical labor had always been his refuge from the chaos inside his head. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and still. Arthur's shirt stuck to his back with sweat. He paused to drink from his water bottle and noticed movement in the distance. A rider approaching from the direction of town. Sheriff Matthews again. The man seemed to have developed a sudden interest in Arthur's remote property. Arthur secured his tools and mounted his horse, riding back toward the cabin at a steady pace that would arrive just ahead of his visitor. He reached the cabin, dismounted, making sure to position himself between the house and the cellar door. Matthews arrived minutes later, his horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride. "Morning, Arthur, Sheriff." Matthews dismounted and walked to the water trough, allowing his horse to drink. He moved slowly, deliberately, taking time to study Arthur's property with the careful attention of a man looking for something specific. Hot day. For fence work, Matthews observed. Arthur waited. The sheriff had not ridden out here to discuss the weather. Been thinking about our conversation. About choices and doing the right thing. Matthews walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. Samuel Tucker's a patient man, but his patience has limits. The longer his property stays missing, the more determined he becomes to find it. Still don't know anything about Tucker's business. Course you don't. Matthews smiled without warmth. But a man might hear things, see things. Even if he doesn't, go looking for trouble. The sheriff's eyes moved to the cabin, then to the barn, then to the small garden behind the house. Searching, cataloging, Arthur felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before his episodes. You live alone. Out here, Arthur, no neighbors for miles. A man could disappear without anyone knowing for days. The threat hung between them, heavy and unmistakable. Arthur's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. That sounds like a warning, Sheriff. Just an observation. Matthews mounted his horse and gathered the reins. Think about what I said. About choices and consequences. Sometimes the right choice is the one that keeps a man alive. Arthur watched him ride away until the dust settled and the silence returned. His hands shook as he walked to the cabin. The infected wound on his shoulder burned with fresh pain. Inside the cabin, Arthur sat at his wooden table and opened the box containing his papers. He spread them out in the pale light filtering through the window. Military records. Discharge papers. The wanted poster with its crude drawing and faded ink. Arthur had built his life on the assumption that the past stayed buried. Now he wondered if he had been fooling himself. Some secrets had weight that made them sink deeper. Others had a way of floating back to the surface when you least expected them. He folded the papers and returned them to the box. Then he walked to the cellar and opened the heavy door. Machan sat in the corner, reading a book by candlelight. Arthur recognized the volume. One of his own books from the small collection he kept on the shelf above his bed. You went through my things. Machan looked up calmly. I needed something. To pass the time, you went through my cabin. I needed to know who I was trusting with my life. Arthur descended the wooden steps. The book in her hands was a collection of military tactics and strategy. Not the kind of reading material most people would choose for entertainment. Find anything interesting? Some things. Machan closed the book and set it aside. She reached into the folds of her makeshift clothing and withdrew a folded paper. Arthur's military discharge papers. The documents that had given him his new identity. John Marston, she said quietly. Confederate deserter. Crossed lines at Antietam and joined the Union forces. Arthur's vision blurred at the edges. The familiar symptoms of an approaching episode. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. You're not Arthur Morgan, Machan continued. You're a man hiding from his past, just like me. The words hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. 10 years of carefully constructed lies crumbling in the space of a single sentence. He reached for the paper, but Machan pulled it back. I'm not going to turn you in, she said. But I need to know who you really are. Arthur sank onto a wooden crate, his legs suddenly unsteady. The cellar felt smaller than before, the walls pressing in from all sides. He fought to control his breathing, to keep the war memories from overwhelming him. I was 19 when they conscripted me, he said finally. Fought for the Confederacy for 2 years. Saw things that broke something inside me. Machan waited in silence. Arthur stared at his hands, remembering the weight of a rifle and the faces of men he had killed in service to a cause he never believed in. Antietam changed everything. Watched my unit execute surrendering Union soldiers. Boys who had thrown down their weapons and begged for mercy. The memories rose fresh and sharp. Arthur's hands began to tremble. The familiar tightness gripped his chest. I crossed lines that night. Told the Union forces everything I knew about Confederate positions. They gave me a new name and new papers when the war ended. Arthur Morgan, a dead man's identity. Someone who died at Gettysburg with no family to claim him. Machan handed him back the papers. Arthur folded them carefully and tucked them into his shirt pocket. Why tell me this? He asked. Because I understand what it means to become someone else in order to survive. Arthur looked at her directly for the first time since entering the cellar. Her eyes held the same haunted quality he recognized in his own reflection. The weight of choices that could not be undone. What's your real story, Machan? She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cellar door and stirring the dust. My name is Machan Washington, she said finally. I didn't answer Samuel Tucker's advertisement by accident. I came here looking for him. Arthur waited for more explanation. None. Came. Why? Because he has my sister. And I'm going to get her back. The words fell into the silence between them with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Arthur understood that everything he thought he knew about this woman had been wrong. She was not running from Samuel Tucker. She was hunting him. The revelation changed everything. Arthur had been protecting a victim. Now he discovered he was harboring someone far more dangerous than he had imagined. Someone with her own agenda and her own secrets. Outside, the wind continued to rise, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Inside the cellar, 2 strangers sat in the candlelight, their carefully constructed lies finally stripped away. The truth lay between them now, raw and unforgiving. Arthur had thought his biggest risk was hiding a desperate woman from the law. Instead, he had committed himself to something far more complex and dangerous. Machan Washington was not seeking rescue. She was planning war. Arthur climbed out of the cellar and stood in his yard, staring at the horizon where dust devils danced in the heat. The weight of Machan's revelation pressed against his chest. Her sister, Samuel Tucker, a hunt disguised as flight. He had thought he was protecting a victim. Instead, he had allied himself with someone planning war. The infected wound on his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. Arthur rolled up his sleeve and examined the angry red edges where the old bullet had never fully healed. The flesh felt hot to the touch, radiating pain down his arm. Inside the cabin, Arthur retrieved his medical supplies from a wooden chest: whiskey for cleaning wounds, needle and thread for stitching, bandages torn from old shirts. The basic tools of a man who had learned to tend his own injuries in the absence of proper doctors. He returned to the cellar with the supplies and a basin of clean water. Michan sat exactly where he had left her, her back straight against the earthen wall. The candle flame cast shadows that made her face appear carved from stone. "I need you to clean this wound," Arthur said, settling onto the wooden crate. Michan rose and examined his shoulder. Her fingers moved with practiced skill, probing the infected tissue and testing the mobility of the joint. She had the touch of someone who understood anatomy and injury. "This is old," she said. "Years old. Sharpsburg, Confederate sniper. The bullet is still inside." Arthur nodded. He had lived with the foreign metal for a decade, feeling it shift and grind against bone whenever he worked too hard or slept wrong. Some wounds never healed completely. Michan cleaned the infection with gentle efficiency. Her hands remained steady despite the confined space and poor light. Arthur watched her work and recognized the movements of professional training. "You're not just educated," he said. "You're a doctor." "I was. In Boston? Before Boston." Michan finished cleaning the wound and began wrapping it with fresh bandages. Arthur felt the fever breaking as the infected tissue cooled. Her touch carried the confidence of someone who had performed this task countless times. "Tell me about your sister," Arthur said. Michan tied off the bandage and stepped back. "Rosa is 16. She answered Tucker's advertisement 6 months ago. I haven't heard from her since. How do you know she's still alive?" "Because I've seen the others." Arthur waited for more explanation. Michan settled back against the wall, her eyes distant with memory. "Tucker runs a network. Mail-order bride services that target desperate women. They promise new lives and deliver slavery. The sheriff knows, the sheriff profits." Arthur absorbed this information slowly. A conspiracy involving law enforcement and wealthy landowners. The kind of corruption that required careful planning and powerful connections to maintain. "Why come alone?" he asked. "Why not bring the authorities?" "Which authorities? The ones taking bribes from Tucker?" Arthur understood the logic. In a territory where the law served money instead of justice, a person had to create their own solutions. Michan had chosen to hunt Tucker through deception rather than confrontation. "What's your plan?" "Find Rosa, gather evidence, expose the network, and then make sure it never happens again." Arthur heard the steel in her voice. This was not a woman seeking rescue for her sister. This was someone planning to dismantle an entire operation through whatever means necessary. "You'll need help," he said. "I know." "From me?" Michan met his eyes directly. "If you're willing." Arthur considered the offer. He had spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of complication. His survival depended on staying invisible, uninvolved, isolated from the conflicts that could expose his past. Now he was being asked to participate in something that would put him directly in the path of law enforcement and powerful enemies. The smart choice was to help Michan escape and return to his solitary existence. "I'm willing," he said. They spent the next hour planning their approach. Arthur's knowledge of the local terrain combined with Michan's intelligence about Tucker's operation. She had been gathering information for months, tracking the network through newspaper advertisements and correspondence. "Tucker has a ranch 15 miles north," Arthur said. "Big operation. Cattle and horses. Employs maybe 20 men. The women are kept in a separate building, locked at night, guarded during the day. How do you know? I was there for 3 days before I escaped. Arthur studied her face in the candlelight. No fear, no hesitation. Just the calm determination of someone who had already survived the worst part of her ordeal. We'll need to get closer, he said. Scout the layout. Find out where they're keeping Rosa. I can get back inside. Too dangerous. Tucker will be watching for you. Then we find another way. Arthur climbed back to ground level and walked to his cabin. He retrieved a spyglass from his war equipment and a detailed map of the surrounding territory. Tools from his military past that might prove useful in planning an assault. He returned to the cellar and spread the map on the wooden crate. Michan studied the terrain features and marked Tucker's property with her finger. There's a ridge. Here, Arthur said, pointing to the eastern approach. Good cover for observation. How far? Half a day's ride. They planned to leave before dawn, taking advantage of the cool morning air and the cover of darkness. Arthur's horse could carry them both, and his knowledge of the back trails would keep them away from main roads and curious eyes. What about? The sheriff? Michan asked. He'll be watching your property. Let him watch. He won't find anything. Arthur had already decided to leave a cold campfire and scattered belongings to suggest he had gone hunting. Matthews would assume he was, avoiding further confrontation about the reward money. If we're caught, Arthur said, we're both dead. I know. Tucker has connections, money, influence. I know. The law won't protect us. Michan folded the map and handed it back to him. The law hasn't protected anyone Tucker has hurt. That's why we're doing this ourselves. Arthur climbed back to the surface and prepared for the night. He cleaned his rifle and counted his ammunition, sharpened his knife and checked his horse's shoes. The familiar rituals of a soldier preparing for battle. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching rain. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a storm before morning. Arthur watched the sky and remembered other nights when he had prepared for missions that might not see him live to dawn. The difference now was that he was not fighting for a cause imposed by others. He was choosing his own battle for his own reasons. The distinction felt important in ways he could not fully articulate. Inside the cellar, Michan sat in the candlelight, her hands folded in her lap. She had the stillness of someone who had learned to wait patiently for the right moment to act. Arthur recognized the quality from his own years of hiding. Tomorrow they would begin the hunt in earnest. Tonight they rested in the calm before the storm, two damaged people who had found purpose in each other's cause. The candle flame flickered. In the draft from the cellar door, Arthur watched it dance and thought about the choices that had brought him to this moment. 10 years of running from his past had led him here, to a partnership with a woman whose future was as uncertain as his own. He had lived alone for years. Now he would discover what it meant to fight alongside someone who understood the weight of necessary secrets. They rode out before dawn, Arthur's horse carrying them both through the darkness toward the eastern ridge. The air held the coolness that came before sunrise, and the ground beneath them showed patches of frost that would vanish with the first touch of sunlight. Michan sat behind Arthur, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. He could feel the tension in her body, the coiled energy of someone approaching the moment they had been preparing for. Her breathing remained steady despite the risk they were taking. The ridge overlooked Tucker's ranch from a distance of half a mile. Arthur guided his horse up the rocky slope, following game trails that wound between scattered boulders and scrub pine. The terrain offered good cover for observation while remaining far enough away to avoid detection. They dismounted at the crest and secured the horse in a grove of trees. Arthur retrieved his spyglass and found a position among the rocks that provided a clear view of the valley below. The ranch spread out in the gray light of early morning, buildings arranged in a rough square around a central courtyard. There, Michan pointed to a small structure separated from the main complex. That's where they keep the women. Arthur focused the spyglass on the building. A single-story construction with barred windows and a heavy door. 2 men sat on the porch, rifles across their laps. Guards maintained around. The clock. How many women? Arthur asked. 8 when I was there. Maybe more now. Arthur studied the layout of the ranch, noting the positions of the guards and the patterns of movement in the courtyard. Tucker ran a disciplined operation with military precision. The kind of organization that came from experience and careful planning. Tucker's got more men than I thought, Arthur said. He recruits from drifters and criminals. Men who won't ask questions about the work. Arthur watched a group of riders leave the ranch, heading south toward town. Business as usual. Tucker's operation continued while they planned their assault from the rocks above. We need to get closer, Michan said. I have to know if Rosa is still there. Arthur lowered the spyglass. Too dangerous in daylight. We wait until dark. They spent the day taking turns with the spyglass, mapping the routine of guards and workers. Arthur sketched the layout in his notebook, marking buildings and defensive positions. Military habits. From a war that had ended years ago but still shaped his thinking. Michan watched the building where the women were held with focused intensity. Her hands remained steady on the spyglass, but Arthur noticed the tightness around her eyes. The controlled desperation of someone looking for a face that might not be there. Tell me about Rosa, Arthur said during a break in their surveillance. She's smart, reads everything she can get her hands on. Wants to be a teacher. Like you wanted to be a doctor? I was a doctor in Philadelphia, before the war changed everything. Arthur understood. The war had taken many things from many people. Professions and dreams had been casualties alongside the soldiers who died in the fields. What happened? The hospital where I worked was burned. They said colored doctors weren't needed anymore. Arthur absorbed this information without comment. He had seen enough of the world to know that peace treaties didn't end all the wars. Some conflicts continued long after the official fighting stopped. So you came west, he said. Rosa came first. She was supposed to write. When the letters stopped coming, I knew something was wrong. The sun climbed higher, turning the air hot and still. Arthur felt sweat gather under his shirt despite the shade of the rocks. The infected wound on his shoulder throbbed with a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. There, Michan said suddenly. Arthur took the spyglass and focused on the building. A woman had appeared at one of the barred windows, young with dark hair and delicate features. She pressed her face against the bars, staring out at the landscape, with the hopeless expression of someone who had given up expecting rescue. Is that her? Yes. Arthur heard the emotion in Michan's voice, relief mixed with pain. Rosa was alive, but she was a prisoner in a place designed to break spirits and destroy hope. We get her out tonight, Arthur said. How? Arthur studied. The guard positions through the spyglass. 2 men on the porch. Others patrolling the perimeter. The building was isolated enough to approach from the rear, but they would need a distraction to draw the guards away. Fire, Arthur said. Something to pull their attention to the other side of the ranch. That's dangerous. Everything we're doing is dangerous. They finalized their plan as the sun began to set. Arthur would create a diversion by setting fire to the hay barn on the eastern edge of the property. While the guards responded to the emergency, Michan would approach the women's building and free Rosa. What about the others? Michan asked. We can't save them all, not tonight. Arthur saw the conflict in her face, the desire to help everyone warring with the practical reality of their limitations. They had one chance to get Rosa out alive. Attempting to rescue all the women would doom them all. We'll come back for them, Arthur said. Promise? Promise. They descended from the ridge as full darkness fell. Arthur led the way down the rocky slope, following the same game trails they had used that morning. The horse waited patiently in the grove, cropping grass and resting after the long day. Arthur checked his rifle and counted his ammunition. Enough for a fight if things went wrong. Enough to buy time for Machan to escape with Rosa if he didn't make it out alive. If I don't come back, he said, take Rosa and head for Colorado. There's a town called Durango where no one asks questions about the past. You're coming back. If I don't, Machan met his eyes in the darkness. We both come back. Together, Arthur nodded, though he had no faith in their chances. Tucker's ranch was a fortress designed to keep people in and intruders out. Their plan depended on luck and timing in equal measure. They rode toward the ranch in silence, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Arthur's horse moved carefully through the darkness, finding its footing on uncertain ground. The infected wound on his shoulder pulsed with each movement, reminding him of his own mortality. Half a mile from the ranch, Arthur dismounted and prepared the materials for his diversion. Dry grass and kindling wrapped in cloth soaked with kerosene from his lantern. Enough to start a fire that would burn bright and draw attention. Remember, he said to Machan, get Rosa and get out. Don't wait for me. I'll wait. Don't. Arthur disappeared into the darkness, moving toward the eastern edge of Tucker's property. Behind him, Machan prepared for her own approach to the building where her sister waited behind barred windows. The night air carried the scent of smoke before Arthur even lit his fire. Somewhere in the distance, another blaze was already burning. He paused and listened, trying to identify the source of the unexpected development. Then he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Riders moving fast through the darkness. Arthur realized their carefully planned assault was about to become something far more complicated and dangerous. The hunt had become a trap, and they were about to discover who was really being hunted. The hoofbeats grew louder as Arthur crept toward the hay barn. Sheriff Matthews and 3 deputies rode hard toward Tucker's ranch, their torches cutting through the darkness. Arthur pressed himself against the barn wall and watched them approach the main house. Something had changed. The timing was too convenient, the arrival too purposeful. Arthur realized they had been expected. He circled back toward where he had left Machan, moving carefully through the shadows. The infected wound on his shoulder burned with each step, but he pushed through the pain. They needed to abort the mission before it became a trap. Arthur found Machan crouched behind a water trough, watching the activity around the main house. She turned as he approached her, eyes questioning. It's a setup, he whispered. They knew we were coming. How? Arthur studied the scene before them. Too many guards. Too much preparation. Someone had anticipated their assault and arranged a reception. We need to leave, Arthur said. Now. Not without Rosa. Machan pointed toward the building where the women were held. In the confusion of the sheriff's arrival, the guards had left their posts to join the gathering at the main house. The building stood undefended for the first time since their surveillance began. 5 minutes, Arthur said. Then we go whether she's with us or not. Machan nodded and moved toward the building. Arthur positioned himself to watch for approaching guards, his rifle ready. The wound on his shoulder throbbed with increasing intensity, making his grip unsteady. Machan reached the building and tried the door. Locked, she moved to the barred windows and called softly to the women inside. Faces appeared at the bars, pale and frightened in the moonlight. Rosa, Machan called. Rosa Washington. A young woman pressed her face against the bars of the center window. Even in the darkness, Arthur could see the family resemblance. The same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. Machan? Rosa's voice carried disbelief and hope in equal measure. I'm getting you out of here. Machan examined the window bars, testing their strength. The metal was old and corroded, weakened by years of weather and neglect. She found a loose stone and began working at the mortar around one of the bars. Arthur watched the main house, counting the men gathered around Sheriff Matthews. Too many for a simple arrest. They were planning something larger, something that required significant manpower. "Hurry," Arthur called softly. Michan had loosened one bar enough to bend it aside. The opening was narrow, but Rosa was small enough to squeeze through. Other women pressed against the remaining bars, their faces desperate with the possibility of escape. "What about us?" one of them asked. "I'll come back," Michan promised. "I'll bring help." Rosa dropped to the ground outside the window. She was thinner than Arthur had expected, weakened by months of captivity, but still capable of movement. Michan wrapped her arms around her sister, holding her close for a moment before pulling back. "Can you travel?" Michan asked. "I can do whatever I have to do." Arthur heard shouts from the direction of the main house. Someone had discovered their presence. Torches began moving toward their position, spreading out in a search pattern. "Time to go," Arthur said. They moved away from the building, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the torchlight. Arthur led them toward the spot where he had left his horse, using his knowledge of the terrain to find the safest route. Behind them, the ranch erupted in activity. Men shouted orders and spread out across the property. Arthur realized they had perhaps 10 minutes before the search reached their position. They found the horse grazing peacefully in the grove of trees. Arthur helped Rosa mount behind Michan, then swung up into the saddle. The horse snorted nervously at the additional weight, but responded to Arthur's gentle pressure. "Where do we go?" Michan asked. Arthur considered their options. Tucker's men would expect them to head for town or follow the main roads. Their best chance lay in the wilderness, where his knowledge of the backcountry would give them an advantage. "North," Arthur said, "toward the mountains." They rode away from the ranch, following game trails that wound through rocky terrain. The horse picked its way carefully in the darkness, guided by Arthur's hands and the instincts that came from years of navigating difficult ground. Behind them, the torches spread out across the valley floor. Arthur could hear the sound of pursuit, growing fainter as they climbed higher into the hills. The infected wound on his shoulder felt like fire, but he forced himself to remain alert. "How did they know?" Rosa asked. "Someone told them we were coming," Arthur replied. "Who?" Arthur had been thinking about the same question. Their plan had been known only to him and Michan. Unless someone had been watching them during their surveillance, monitoring their movements and reporting back to Tucker. "Sheriff Matthews," Arthur said. "He's been watching my property, probably followed us when we left." They rode through the night, climbing steadily into the mountains. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, and Arthur felt some of the fever from his infection begin to break. The clean mountain air helped clear his head. At dawn they reached a high meadow surrounded by pine trees. Arthur called a halt and dismounted, checking their back trail for signs of pursuit. The valley below showed no movement, but he knew Tucker's men would continue searching. "We need to keep moving," Arthur said. "They'll track us through the daylight." "Where are we going?" Rosa asked. Arthur looked at the peaks rising around them. Colorado lay beyond the mountains, a territory where their past could be left behind and new lives could be built. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere we can start over." Michan helped Rosa down from the horse. The sisters stood together in the morning light, and Arthur saw the resemblance clearly now. Both carried the same strength, the same refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. "What about the others?" Rosa asked. "The women we left behind." "We'll find a way to help them," Michan promised. "When we're safe, when we have resources." Arthur knew the promise would be difficult to keep. Tucker's operation was well protected and politically connected. Exposing it would require evidence and allies they did not currently possess. But looking at the determination in both sisters' faces, Arthur believed they would find a way. They had survived their individual ordeals and found each other again. Together, they might accomplish what none of them could achieve alone. They remounted and continued their journey into the mountains. The sun climbed higher, warming the air and revealing the beauty of the wilderness around them. Arthur felt a peace he had not experienced in years. He had spent a decade running from his past. Now he was riding toward a future he could choose for himself. The infected wound on his shoulder still burned, but the fever was breaking. Some wounds healed when you stopped running and started fighting. Behind them, the valley held Tucker's ranch and the corruption that had driven them into the mountains. Ahead lay Colorado and the possibility of justice delayed but not denied. Arthur had lived alone for years until a woman appeared at his fence seeking help. Now he rode with two sisters who had become his family, bound together by shared struggle and mutual trust. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, offering both sanctuary and the promise of a new beginning. Arthur guided his horse toward the high passes, carrying his chosen family toward whatever future they would build together. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.